I started playing Hybrid Heaven for my stream about 2 months ago. I had known about it for years, read about it in Nintendo Power actually, and I always meant to try it, but I kept putting it off until it was suggested to me. I'm sure lots of people have said this before, but Hybrid Heaven has a lot of rough edges. As an RPG, it's very drab. A good chunk of the game, I'm not done yet, shut up, I can talk about this part if I want, is on an alien ship, so there's not a lot of variety in the settings, and the level design is redundant to a fault, to the point that you'll enter rooms that repeat sections 4 times just to go down to a lower floor of the ship that has a ridiculously similar setup. I actually like the plot though. They are leaning into the body snatcher stuff as hard as possible, and I really want to see how far they go with it, since it's had some interesting payoffs so far, so I call that a plus. But it's not exactly a must-see story. And as an action game, it's a little unsatisfying. There's not a lot of challenging platforming, thankfully, because the movement is a little stiff, and the puzzles so far have amounted to checking every room and backtracking afterwards. But the game's idea of setting up obstacles is propping up annoying traps and hiding enemy encounters behind bad camera angles. The game's camera is no help either. I eventually just used my gun as a pseudo first-person view. But where those elements intersect is in the battle system, which is my favorite part of the game, and the one thing about Hybrid Heaven that seems to leave a lasting impression. Beating body snatchers, aliens, and robots in one-on-one fistfights is always fun, and the cross between free-running movement and turn-based commands, coupled with a power meter that can enhance your moves and even let you make custom combos, is actually really satisfying to use. It's all tempered by a stamina system, but honestly, I hardly ever noticed it until I got to a point where I could start stringing attacks back to back to back. You start off strong enough to knock biological weapons flat on their backs and tank shots from laser guns, and you just keep getting stronger from there. And the little touches on the movement in the fights, the way your arm pulls back after a hook or straight punch, the great form on the wrestling throws and submission holds, the stance your character starts to adopt over time as you favor certain moves, it's all fantastic. The wrestling moves, in particular, are really fun to use. I obviously have a bias because I like that sort of thing, but I think even without that, they're really worth noting. From what I could look up, a few people on the staff, including one of the members of the battle team, had worked on a wrestling game named
Jikkyou Power Pro Wrestling 96 Max Voltage!
which was a solid wrestling game for the SNES released in 1996. I'm going to make a big assumption here and say that the experience from that title probably bled into Hybrid Heaven's grappling, and the game's better for it. There are some enemies you can't throw though. Lots of enemies in this game have pros and cons to them, and there's plenty of times where they're really good at dealing with a specific type of attack, either because they're invulnerable to an attack, or because they're way better at it than you are, and trying to lock up, outpunch, outkick, or outgun them is a losing proposition. Combine that with the pros and cons of either biding your time so you can attack with a flurry of blows, or doing consistent damage, spacing out your approaches and retreats, and even some limited environmental damage, and there's a lot to think about during each fight, which is why I'm thankful that they're mostly just one-on-one fights, at least so far. Up until this point, Hybrid Heaven's been a great time. I'm pleasantly surprised by what it gets right, and its flaws aren't too frustrating to deal with. I really hope the second half of this game holds up as well. In the meantime, I recommend finding a way to try the game for yourself, if only for a little bit. Don't commit too hard, just, take a peek. I've cleared Hybrid Heaven, and I have had lots of time to digest the endgame and conclusion of this unorthodox title. So, what do I think about it?
Peak fiction. Goat. Raw. Fire.
I really think it's the best game of its kind, which is fortunate because it's the only game of its kind released by a major publisher, and honestly, I don't know about any indie games that work this way. My primary interest in playing this game was to see what the versus mode was like after the game was cleared. The battle system has been streamlined somewhat. You do have some of the options from the main game, but the commands have been mapped to the C buttons. The defensive options still show up in the middle of the screen as a response from the player on the fence. I'm sure anyone who's into Hybrid Heaven and customization heavy fighting games might have a ball, as long as they have a duplicate clear save to mess around with. I'll come back to battle mode a bit once I've figured out how to duplicate my own clear save. There were some points where it might have actually been the worst of its kind. All of its flaws only intensify over the course of the game. The way you build your main character won't really ever work against you because you can still do a little bit of everything even if you specialize in something. But there's still a need to fight everything in your sight if you intend to beat the last few bosses of the game comfortably. I didn't use most of my weapons, stat boosters, or debuff items until near the end of the game, and I can honestly tell you that even if I had saved every item that I found, it wouldn't be enough to deal with the last stretch of the game in a reasonable way. You need to be able to take hits without falling apart and deal enough damage to make up for the boss's ability to heal themselves, and I really don't think you can hit the stats needed to do that in a regular playthrough unless you fight as many of the enemies as you can. It might even be essential in Ultimate mode, because you take 4 times the damage in that mode, and how buff you are might make the difference between dying in 2 hits, dying in 3 hits, or dying because you got stunned at the start of the fight from a blow to the head. In any case, the game's difficulty curve puts a lot of weight on how well you play the game in the early sections, because the better you do there, the stronger you get early on, which has knock-on effects for how hard the game becomes later. I didn't really have any major issues with the combat, and I enjoyed it a lot, but I've seen complaints about how hard the fights are, and I suspect that they stem from a less than optimal start of the game for the first 2 hours or so. What did make the game difficult for me is the ship's design, which only gets worse as the game goes on, because for some godforsaken reason, the map layers lower levels of the ship under the level you're on. It's not just hard to read, it's an eyesore. Couple that with the amount of busy work involved in moving around and it bumps itself up to a migraine-inducing experience. I honestly would have preferred puzzles over this pathfinding, any kind, even something from a Sierra adventure game. It's genuinely the worst part of the game, and I'd understand if anyone wanted to skip it over that alone. And I wouldn't say that the game really makes up for it, but it is interesting to see how it plays out. It's a turn-based brawler with an ATB system and a really hands-on positional grappling system to flesh it out. The bosses were interesting, mostly because they almost always had a way to cheat at least one rule of the game, and a few weren't even standard fights, so I think the game took its bullshit as far as it could go. And at least the story kinda goes somewhere. It was a little melodramatic, but there were at least a few characters that stood out to me, like Diaz, the murderous prick who admittedly has a fair point against you for stealing his identity even if it was an accident. And Anna, the only character who questions the plot or the sequence of events that happen in the game. It's unfortunate how you can kinda tell which characters are made to be interesting and which ones are cannon fodder, but whoever came up with the scenario left a backdoor exit in place by establishing and stressing that they're human duplicates with one-track minds. Hard to tell which came first on that one, whether they were made single-minded in order to cover up their roles as characters, or if their roles as characters were to stress that they were single-minded, but it works out just fine, I think. I really think Hybrid Heaven's worth trying out at least once. It's had almost no impact on gaming as far as I can tell, so it's not like it's a must-see experience, but that's also what makes it stick out. It's like finding the fossils of an extinct genus. There's plenty of incentive to pick its bones apart to try and figure out how well it sticks together. Exploring it any farther than that is up to you. At least if you beat the game on Ultimate mode, you get to play as the President, and I guess that puts it in good company. Mostly.